So, what happens when a war on drugs airstrike out in the Caribbean leaves a small fishing village completely heartbroken and, demanding answers? Today, we're going to unpack a story that really pits national security against human rights, and it asks a tough question: who ends up paying the ultimate price?
And we're going to start right here with this really raw question from the uncle of one of the men who was killed. This comes from the small fishing village of Las Quavas in Trinidad. And man, it just cuts straight to the very core of this entire incident.
Because, before we get into all the international politics and the legal arguments, you've got to understand that at its heart, this is a story about a village in mourning, a community that's just trying to grapple with the sudden, violent loss of two of their own, Chad Joseph and Rishi Samaru. And the pain here is it's layered. I mean, the community held awake. But think about this. There were no bodies to recover, so there's no real closure. As Joseph's grandmother explains, in a place like Las Quavas, everybody is family. But what's making their grief even worse is this profound sense of being abandoned. As she says, their own local police never even came to ask a single question. No investigation, nothing. Just silence. Okay, so what exactly happened in the waters off the coast of Venezuela that led to all of this? Let's take a look at the official U.S. side of the story. So here's what we know for sure. A U.S. military airstrike completely destroyed a boat. All 6 people on board, including Chad Joseph and Rishi Samaru from that village, were killed. And the justification for this, well, it came straight from the top. The Trump administration basically framed this whole thing as a victory in the war on drugs. The men were immediately labeled narco-terrorists, and the official line was that intelligence confirmed the boat was trafficking drugs. So, from the U.S. perspective, case closed. But the families and a lot of international human rights groups are pushing back hard on this official narrative. They're arguing that this wasn't really about drugs. It was about a fundamental violation of human rights. And Joseph's cousin LaToya, she asked the question that really gets to the heart of the whole controversy. She's asking, okay, if you suspected them of a crime, why not just stop the boat, detain them, put them on trial? Why was total destruction the only option on the table? So this is where it all gets crystal clear, right? You've got 2 completely different stories. On one side, there's the official U.S. narrative, a legitimate anti-drug operation against quote-unquote narco-terrorists. But on the other side, you have the human rights position, which uses a very different term, extrajudicial execution, a violation of the most basic legal principles we have. Now, that term, extrajudicial execution, is really important. Human Rights Watch uses it for a very specific reason. They're arguing that since the U.S. isn't officially at war with Venezuela or Trinidad, the laws of armed conflict, they just don't apply here. This should have been handled like a law enforcement situation, which, has a totally different set of rules. And that brings us to the absolute core of the legal argument. Under international human rights law, you can only use lethal force as a last resort. There has to be an imminent threat to someone's life. And what Human Rights Watch is saying is that the U.S. has shown zero proof that the men on that boat posed any kind of immediate danger at all. But the impact of this strike, it didn't just end with that explosion at sea. It created these ripples of silence and fear that have spread all the way back to the shores of Trinidad. This quote from Joseph's aunt Lynette, it really just hits you. The complete silence from their own government made them feel invisible, as if the lives of their loved ones just didn't even matter. And look, this isn't just them feeling ignored, it's really happening. The Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, who before this was a pretty vocal supporter of U.S. operations in the area, has just consistently dodged reporters' questions about the deaths of her own citizens. And that silence from the top, it has this terrifying, chilling effect on the ground. The fishers of Las Quavas, people who literally depend on the sea to feed their families, are now reportedly too scared to even leave the shore. An entire community's way of life is paralyzed by fear. Now, this whole incident, as tragic as it is, it doesn't exist in a vacuum. To really get what's going on, we have to zoom out and look at the bigger picture of U.S. operations in the Caribbean. Take a look at this number, 27. It's so important. According to reports, that's how many other people had already been killed in similar U.S. operations in the same area before this happened. So this wasn't some one-off event. It's actually part of a much larger and deadlier pattern. And this is where you see activists like David Abdullah stepping in. They see this not just as a drug bust, but as a renewed U.S. militarization of the entire Caribbean. They're pointing to a long, long history of American intervention in places like Grenada and Haiti, and they're basically saying, hey, this region needs to be a zone of peace, not a battlefield for America's war on drugs. All of which brings us back to this one really critical question. In a huge global campaign like the war on drugs, who gets to decide the price of justice? Who decides when a life can be taken without a trial, without due process? And for communities like Las Quavas, who is ultimately the one left to pay that price?